I like how it says you are live.
Yeah.
It takes
really
a little bit. It takes a little bit to catch up, though.
Yeah.
When it's live like that.
I don't know.
We are currently live. It takes a second for it to show up for the live viewers, but all of what you just said was recorded, which I found out when I was watching my VOD from the Cirrus interview last night. So that was interesting.
Yeah, that was funny because you had like a second where you were on, and I was like, I wonder if that's pre-recorded. Nope. You came back, and there you were. I was like,
It's not pre-recorded.
I got a notification.
Yeah. Part of the problem is that the delay is just long enough that I can't start it right when I hit the live button, but it's just short enough that I can't exactly know how to time it. So I did a countdown, and I was like, okay, if we pop up for a second, then I'll just play the intro.
Go. And Kellen and Mark and Tapioca Weasel and Joan.
Hiya.
Welcome to the start of our stream. We are at, this is Divine Disbelief. Susan, I'm Nathaniel. Leah Kai is on the computer up there. And we are in chapter 6 of, what's his name again? Bart Ehrman.
I was like, how do you?
Yes, the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies.
To be fair to Nathaniel, he wasn't here. To be fair, he wasn't here last week, and it's been a couple weeks, so it's fair. Sure. It's fine.
Hey, ProLib, welcome in. But yes, we are. He is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So there it is. Reading his book, Heaven and Hell. And then there's also a subtitle. I forgot. So we are.
The History of the Afterlife.
There it is. Wow. Usually it's longer than that. Like How Jesus Became God has a super long subtitle. And
I don't doubt that.
Yeah. The something about the, Jewish rabbi from, first century Palestine, stuff like that.
Maybe it's like the more scholarly the work, the longer the subtitle.
I've noticed that the scholarly papers tend to follow that train of thought. Most papers that have short titles tend to not be hyper specific.
Yeah, so we have forgery and counter forgery, and then that's the title, and then it says history of first century polemics in first and second century Christianity. So yeah, it's a longer title. Yeah. But today, I am really excited because, first off, I'm back. It's been like 3 weeks since I was here, I think. Something like that.
Yeah.
And you guys have been going through. You actually got to Judaism the last time that we had a show. And hey, Jen and Comrade and Sam. And this week, we get into the first mentioning of apocalypticism, which is my favorite.
You do really love apocalypticists.
I do. Because Jesus was an apocalypticist.
He was.
And so, I think he's like my favorite character in history, I'd imagine. And this gets into the Jewish side of it.
Yep. Just realized we didn't say that this is Secular Literary Circle.
Oh, yeah.
So hi, this is Secular Literary Circle.
Again,
yeah, it's the weekly chaos that we attempt to put together most weeks on Tuesday nights, going through various books. We're halfway through this one, which means in a few weeks we're probably going to be putting up the poll fairly soon to talk about. We're trying to kind of alternate between history and science. So this is one of the history books. There's a couple of different science books that we had talked about potentially putting up. But yeah, we're going to have to do that in like a month or two.
Yep, for sure.
Excited for that.
Yeah, I'm really excited for that too.
Yeah.
See what we're going to get into next. So if you guys have ideas about that, let us know. But if you are a fan of the Bible, we talk about the Bible tonight. We're going to talk about the book of Daniel, the book of Job. We're going to talk about things that what's known as the Apocrypha.
Yeah, right? It was like Ezekiel and
Enoch.
Enoch,
Ezekiel, as well as this. You've heard the Song of Solomon, and you've heard of the Psalms of David. And now we take a little bit of time to look at the Psalms of Solomon. And he mentions, I noticed this also, like the life of Adam and Eve, which is an intertestamental as well. But doesn't actually go into it. But so if you like the Bible, we get into it tonight.
You are in for a great treat.
Yes.
It even says so in the description.
And Chris says, the book of Job, that is my niche. That's how I say that, by the way. I know that people say niche or niche.
Niche.
I'm going to put it in somewhere. It's in the niche.
I've always heard it niche.
Yes.
So, very nice.
Yep. So
we got a little bit into the Bible last week when we started talking about the early Jewish prophets and how they didn't really seem to have much of a conceptualization of the afterlife. Like, you died, and Sheol apparently meant grave. And like Bart, if you guys missed the last episode, Bart goes so deep into all of the justifications for why he can be very confident asserting that using the text primarily. Like, he doesn't reference a ton of other scholarly work on it. He uses specifically linguistics in the text itself. It is well worth the watch and the read. Like, if you guys aren't reading along with us, you're missing out.
Yes.
Yeah. I really had liked this chapter because I'm not really much of a Bible reader, so to speak, I guess. So it was really nice to be able to see this stuff in a different sort of context. Like,
well, in particularly cultural context.
Yeah. Because we'll get to that when we get to that. So I have a whole bunch of notes. I actually took all my notes today. So
she did.
I did.
While I was reading, what was I reading today?
I don't know.
I was reading Get Woke, something with the church.
Oh, yeah.
But I was also reading something by Shannon Sullivan. I forget what it's called. So you were reading that, or you were doing this, and I was like, oh yeah, that's for tonight. I'm going to read that later.
All right. So Dr. Ehrman starts the chapter. He gives a basic rundown of what Jewish people basically started to think about death and how it was a time of vindication for God and his people. There's a quote that I pulled: when history in all its evil and suffering had run its course, God would reassert his sovereignty over this world and destroy everything and everyone who was opposed to him, bringing in the perfect utopian world he had originally planned. Utopia, man.
Yeah.
That's a big promise.
Now, of course, oh yeah. But the important part about this is that it is Earth.
Yes.
It is the planet.
Yes.
It is not anything else.
It is not like the concept of like the heavens.
Correct. It's the cosmos and all that is no. It is on Earth. In fact, paradise simply means garden.
It does.
So that's important to note as we mentioned, like this utopia and stuff. This has a lot to do with, the Garden of Eden and stuff. So
yeah.
Well, and a lot of it also, like the author, like Ehrman stresses here too, it was bodily resurrection. It's not some sort of immortality of the soul we're talking about here. This is not some other place it is, or that your soul is going to dwell here on earth either. It's God is somehow going to miraculously bring the bodies back of all of the dead people who supported him through history, who are righteous, and they get to live on earth as a, stable, basically the Garden of Eden restored for all of eternity.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Again, big promise.
Yeah. Don't worry.
Promise.
What's up, Mikey? Don't worry, you'll get to come back type deal. Even though I said you can't ever come back.
Yeah.
You get to come back. Just don't pay attention to that book. Yeah. I promise Moses wrote it.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Basically, yeah. I'm gonna pull it. Told you. So
pulling the levers.
So
my
phone's so much different than looking at the computer.
Oh yeah, I'd imagine so. So he would also, of course, resurrect those who were evil. Originally, they would be resurrected to see the awful things they had done, and eventually end up destroying them for all time as the final punishment. This view did sort of eventually change a little bit. They'd still be resurrected, but they'd end up having to suffer and be tormented. No word on how long the torment lasts, though. Ehrman did not go into that.
At this point,
is it eternal?
No, it is not. It has to do with annihilation theory.
Oh.
Because, and I think he actually mentions it at the end of this chapter, where he gets into the annihilation theory.
Potentially.
Yep. Which, by the way, spoiler, Jesus. Hey, Ricardo, good to see you. And yeah, he that's whenever you are resurrected and you're judged at that point.
Oh yeah, that's a lot of what they go through, or what he goes through in the chapter.
Yeah, and that's this is a nice little prelude to that.
Yeah.
And I do like that he gets into at the beginning that the origin of resurrection, the commonly held misconception regarding where the idea comes from is that a lot of folks like to give it to Zoroaster.
Right.
And that's not true.
No, because it actually the idea of it coming from Zoroastrianism since that had sort of been hotly debated for a while,
Mhm.
It actually, let me see where that went. So we don't actually have any of the Zoroastrian texts to support this theory and its appearance before it actually showed up in Jewish writings. And they also say that the timing doesn't really make sense since Judah wasn't under Persian rule whenever the bodily resurrection actually first shows up in their texts.
Yep. And that makes sense. You know, having access to more and more of this stuff archaeologically really gives us an idea of what we are looking at. And this, of course, comes from like Babylonian texts and those things that are in like we talk about the Seleucid in a little bit over onto like the eastern side of the Middle East. And it was for a long time. And if you hear people that are either in the minority scholarship or are pseudo scholars, I guess, they mention Zoroaster a lot. Or, Richard Carrier, he mentions Zoroaster.
So pseudo scholars.
That's how you know it's wrong.
You couldn't resist the dunk on Carrier, could you? Could you?
I know that Chris is in the chat, so we're fine.
I would not have let him resist that dunk.
To be fair, I have a feeling that Chrissy's going to continue that dunk for the rest of the stream.
I was like, while I was saying that, trying to decide if I was going to.
When in doubt, dunk on Carrier.
Yeah, if you can at all.
Yeah.
He's a sexual predator. Fuck him.
Yeah, fuck that guy.
That's the one. We don't get any more because then it's no longer PG-13. We found that out. MPAA, you suck.
However, one of the things that I do actually like that he does go into, though, under the rise of apocalyptic thinking, is sort of what the socio-political stuff was that was going on in in Judah at the time, in particular. Talking about sort of the reconciling of why is it if there's this single just God that rules over everything and no other gods exist, why do these people, and like according to the ancient prophets, the righteous behavior of an individual or a group then gets rewards versus the crappy behavior gets punishments. Why is it that the righteous quite often get punished and the terrible seem to get rewarded?
Yeah.
And so there's this idea that perhaps some of this thinking could have gone on because there was such a long period of seeming quote unquote punishment going on in Judah at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, you read how many different books in the Bible that it's just like it's seemingly, season after season after season to where Yahweh is just like, nah, man, get it again. Here's another plague. Here's a drought. Here's another Richard Carrier book. Enjoy your horrible, horrible life.
That's two, and I love him. Yeah, so it's the whole problem of evil with the jingly keys and why do babies get cancer and stuff like that. So there's some prophets like Jeremiah, Hosea, and Joel they've all basically said the same thing, that people are evil sinners and God is punishing them because suffering comes from God in order to penalize people for not living the way he thinks they should.
Yep, and because he is the monotheistic God, cough cough, they're polytheistic. It comes down to, well, how does this work then? Right?
Yeah.
How does this work if there are no other gods for us to get pissed at? And by the way, important note, Habakkuk, which is probably the coolest name in the Bible, doesn't get mentioned here. Prophet Habakkuk, Bart, why? Just saying. It's not mentioned with Joel and everybody else. And it's not Joel either.
Oh.
Dicks.
Part of what he does bring up, though, is that this is where the idea of other supernatural beings, not necessarily gods, but other supernatural beings are directly responsible for the harm to God's people, not just God himself. You don't just have to worry about Jehovah getting mad at you or Yahweh getting mad at you. Now you have to worry about these other things that are also going to keep screwing with you, because I guess the people of Judah just saw themselves as perpetually tormented.
Yeah, well, I mean, you live in the fucking desert.
Yeah, I'd see myself as.
Oh no, now we're R. My bad.
Now we're what?
Now we're R rated.
Aw, dang it! Why'd you have to swear? We were doing so well.
We get one. Everybody gets one.
Yeah, I did two.
So there was a little note that I made about, what did I call it?
PJ.
pre-Jesus. There was a word that I wrote down. I think I called it like cosmic nemesis or something, or he called it cosmic nemesis or something like that.
Yeah, the Satan.
I remember just being like, "That's the best! I love that phrasing."
Yes. Oh, yeah, it's the character in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and the thing with Satan, or as most people know him as Satan, you can hear my cat meowing. Is that whenever he appears in Job, or they appear in Job, because I don't believe that there is actually any sort of, gender assigned. So they're not actually God's arch rival, because they're actually like an advisor / counselor to God and doing his bidding. Yeah. We had this little conversation earlier about how he can't, like, Satan can't do these things basically without permission.
Correct.
And while they're like challenging each other in the Book of Job, sort of.
Yeah, it's a bet.
Yeah, Satan's just all like, I can see what I can get him to do.
Which is kind of odd because of God knowing the future type thing. Now, it's important to note, and something we talked about earlier as well, that Satan is not Satan, right? It's not a proper noun. It's not a name,
right? But
rather a title, and translated properly, it simply means adversary.
Right.
Now, we actually first get the glimpse of this character in the Book of Genesis, and which is Balaam and the donkey. And if you've never heard me tell that story before, that is actually one of my favorite stories, because Balaam ends up beating the fuck out of his donkey. Now we're really hard.
Poor donkey.
Yeah, and then of course the reason why, by the way, is because Balaam is to go somewhere. I forget where he's supposed to go.
You guys have your phone on vibrate and it keeps buzzing.
It does.
Well, that's not my. Yeah, it is.
Like, that's him. That's not me. My phone's on silent.
But Balaam's supposed to go somewhere, and he's going back and forth talking to these the people he's trying to like make so that they listen to Yahweh and everything. And it's actually a really kind of crazy story how it goes along. But he's supposed to God actually tells him to do something, and then turns around and says, no, don't do it, but listen to me, but don't listen to me. And so Balaam is like, I'm going to go do this other thing. And so Yahweh sends down the Satan, the adversary. And he's an invisible dude. And he gets in the way. He stands in the road with his sword, right? Or cherubim, if you want. And so Balaam doesn't see him. But, who does? The donkey. The donkey sees this adversary. You know what the donkey does? He's like, bye. And he goes off the road. And so Balaam then is like, what the f are you doing? And he starts beating the shit out of him, right? He's like literally beating him. He's like, get back on the road. And so he gets back on the road and they start going again, and then appears again to the donkey, but not to Balaam, this adversary. And so the donkey then goes the opposite direction. And Balaam then does, the thing, and he's beating the shit out of his donkey. And he's like, get back on the road. And so he does it a third time. And because, he did 3s and 7s and shit. And then he's going to beat the donkey again. And the donkey turns around and is like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, why are you hitting? The donkey literally starts talking to him. These are the, conversations we have in the Hebrew Bible. And he's like, do you think that like, he's like, have I not always been like, an awesome donkey to you? Seriously.
Donkey.
Have I not always done what you wanted? If I went off the road, do you not think that I had a good reason to do so? Right. And so Balaam's like, and then at that point, you get like the predator reveal of the Satan character. And he's like standing there. He's got a sword like at Balaam's neck, basically. Yeah. And that's like the moral of that story, first off, is listen to your donkey. But that this is the character. He would not have been able to go and do that, the adversary, without the blessing of God.
Right.
And God gave him the power to do that. Right.
Yeah.
So he's the adversary, but in this way, he is to be the adversary against Balaam. So not against Yahweh. He's always acting, and we see this in Job as well. And when we talk about that, always in accordance with Yahweh. So this is not this, megalomaniacal figure that's out to murder everybody, steal, kill, and destroy type stuff like we see in the Christian Bible. So
that is typically assigned to Satan, Lucifer,
yes,
the devil.
Capital S given to the name Satan. I love when people say Lucifer as well, as if that's actually in the Bible.
Well, and Ehrman actually goes a little bit, not into that story, but he does go into that idea a little bit when he talks about that God, Yahweh, has given the earth over to these adversaries. That basically it is currently Yahweh's will that these adversaries are going to torture anybody who's righteous for any reason at all as a perpetual test of faith, and that the reward is going to come when the earth is remade in this idea of paradise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course he gets into the Watchers.
Yes. Oh my God, that's so fascinating to me.
Yes.
Everything is fascinating in this book. I say that every single week, every single episode, but it's like, again, it's stuff that you don't get when you're just casually reading or like reading in church.
Yeah. Definitely just reading in church.
Well, it's a good point between the difference between eisegesis and exegesis. We're getting real exegesis in this text. We're looking at a combination of historical context and cultural context here, whereas in church, you're just getting the scripture and maybe a modern interpretation of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maybe is the, but no, the Nephilim.
I'm trying to find...
I'm going to make a video pretty soon about idiots who seem to think that the whole age of heroes in Greek mythology somehow makes the Greek gods the Nephilim. I'm like, first off, are you nuts? Second, as a Hellenist, I've got some opinions on that.
Yeah.
And if there's anybody to actually tell them and set them correct or set them straight, I think it's you.
Yeah,
that's going to be a lot of papers.
Yeah, the Nephilim, definitely not.
Yeah.
They were killed in the flood. Come on. It couldn't have been.
That's true. That's true. Because okay, so let me find where I went again, because like I said, I took extensive notes. Okay. Where did I go?
I don't know.
I'm trying to figure out.
So we just finished the section on the adversaries. We're now on biblical roots for the idea of a future resurrection.
Right.
Yeah. She's trying to find the Nephilim.
Where did I...
Control
I'm
F.
trying to find... Oh, that's not the right screen. I'm trying to find where I actually mentioned...
Yes, Christy Abbey, there are people who say that. I've actually run into people who have said that, and I also... Because I have 2 response sections on my Discord, I got sent a video where another creator on YouTube makes that claim. Isn't that fun?
Yikes. Okay, so I think I was accidentally skipping ahead with what I was thinking about. Yep, I was trying to skip ahead. We're not going to skip ahead. We're going to keep going. Okay, so the actual biblical roots for because the next section is called Biblical Roots for an Idea of a Future Resurrection. The actual idea of a resurrection on the Day of Judgment didn't come out of didn't come out of nowhere 2 centuries before the appearance of Jesus. So the idea of God being the one who gives life is the main basis in general of biblical tradition.
Yes.
So that's actually the main point of the biblical creation story that's contained in Genesis 1-2. Basically miniature Susan version. God makes all the stuff on Earth and around Earth from shit that wasn't alive. But later thinkers, however, debate these origins, and Ehrman says, if God brings living creatures into being and God is eternal, then isn't life eternal even for those who die?
That's a good question.
Yeah. I mean, it's a logical question when you are following the text, when you're actually like diving into it.
Yeah, because the text is not explicit regarding the afterlife. And if you were living at that time, obviously you would know. Mm-hmm. You would have an idea, and they were pretty well in line with one another.
Yeah,
for most part. And then we get a little bit later on here. Yeah, get closer to like the turn of the century. But yeah, you get these ideas in the text where we read it 3, 4, 5,000 years later. Really, it's not that long, but and we get the lack of understanding of the the society and the culture they lived in, and so we don't know what we assume rather erroneously, but again, don't know what the the Bible says, that when they talk about death, they have the exact same ideas and beliefs of the body and the soul as we do. And that simply is not the case, as we have discovered, you know, in the previous chapter, but also even here again as well. So yeah, especially with some of the things that Job says.
Yeah.
Well, and on the subject of that cultural misunderstanding later, we get to the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, which is like, I can see Nathaniel like chomping at the bit to talk about this, because this is an often cited passage for Christians trying to justify the idea of Christ as Messiah. But the word Messiah, as Ehrman points out, doesn't occur anywhere in this passage.
Nope.
Does not.
Yeah.
It does not.
I have spoken about Isaiah 53 as well as the other two songs, because Isaiah is split up into different songs. And this is the third song or poem of, it starts, I think, in like chapter 40 or 41 or something like that. This is the third one. And the suffering servant is a full song. And yes, it's Isaiah 53:7 that's mentioned. He was pierced for our iniquities and crushed and all that nonsense. And they're like, yeah, it was Jesus. And what Bart points out is very good, very, very astute here. And this is something we get. We're reading it today and applying our belief system, if we are Christians, to it as if it was written about Jesus. So we're actually doing kind of like the opposite of research, right? Where we're saying, oh, I already believe this. Now let me go and put my stamp on something that was written beforehand, not about this, but I'm going to say it has to be about this because that fits my my story.
I call it retconning.
I mean, retconning is a very good modern version of eisegesis. And what's interesting about that also is we talked about this. Christians have done that with other passages, like the passage in Genesis about like the exiting of the garden regarding the snake. Like, you know, he shall strike his heel, you know, her heel, etc. His children shall be with enmity with hers, and And people have extrapolated that so far as to like say that it was some sort of covenant that to bring about the Messiah, when it's very obviously meant to be at least partially literal.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the metaphor for the reason we have childbirth. The women have pain in childbirth. This is the reason. And the reason that we have issues with crops not growing in the desert. Maybe it's the fact that it's a desert. Anyways.
Well, it's also meant to be an explanation for why we die too, instead of living forever.
Yeah,
Right,
and that's, by the way, that is the biting of the heel, bruise your heel type stuff. Yeah, and it gets into the overcoming of death type stuff. Kind of. It depends on how you read into that in Genesis chapter 3 or 4. Yeah. But yeah, Isaiah 53. It's actually really great because it builds off of Ezekiel stuff as well, and you know it says he was despised and rejected by others. Now this, depending on your translation, but this is pretty close. A man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. Usually what we hear is pierced for our transgressions. And we hear by his stripes we are healed. Those are not proper translations, but they are put there, as you mentioned, retconning it. There's also the fallacy, I forget what it is, of there's actually a name for that, of doing that to say this is, or as Chrissy says, retroactive reading. Right? Yeah. This is putting on there so that it has that that view, Jesus having been whipped, Jesus having been his hands and his feet pierced with the spikes to go up on the cross, and so it adds that to it as well, off of modern translations which don't match the properly match the text,
right? And
so they say this is Jesus, and it's the prophecy about Jesus and everything. As I don't know, because it takes a little bit of time, but I have argued for a very long time, which I think was very obvious, that they're not talking about a person at all. And I know that Bart gets into that. It takes a little time to build up to it. But I'm just like, just say it.
Say what you're getting at.
No.
There's a long history in the Bible of using a single individual or a single, he brings up the beasts in one particular passage. He also brings up the entirety of Judah being named after a particular person from earlier stories, and Judah being brought up as a name. Like last week we talked about other like cities and states, quote unquote, like kingdoms that were brought up as names and referred to as her or him during biblical stories. So like personifying an entire kingdom is not out of the realm for the Bible at all.
Yeah, and Ehrman says the point that, or makes the point that not only is that they're talking about the nation as a singular sort of proper noun sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's so much like is this a section? I think this is a section where it's like it happened in the past.
No, it's David.
Okay, so I'm
it's
thinking
David, or not David, but Daniel at the end of the chapter.
Okay, yeah, sorry, my bad.
But yeah, it's so the way that it's mentioning it here, and we see it back. I think we go back to like Isaiah 47 or something like that, or 49, where it's quite obviously talking about the nation of Israel. Mm-hmm. And this is why it's he and him. Every other time in the Hebrew Bible that it mentions something like that without an actual person being mentioned, it's always the nation of Israel. Mm-hmm. The Son of God, if not mentioned with a person's name, is always Israel. It's always the people, the nation of Israel. And that's what it is in Isaiah 53 as well.
Yeah.
So,
and then when God actually directly addresses Israel, the nation, in Isaiah 49:3 says, "And he said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then of course they're like, oh yeah. So then he said to Jesus, whom I'm well pleased. Yeah, it's not the same thing. Shut up.
Well, and Chrissy brings up a good point. Moab, Canaan, and Ammon, and others are also put into personhood. And in my video that Chrissy helped me out on in Pride, we talked a lot about the personification of like Babylon in the Babylonian king being punished in a particular passage in Isaiah, and how that was meant to be like it was meant to be showing hubris. Like on the part of them for putting themselves above God.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we get to the Watchers.
Yes.
The Watchers. I don't think it was in this one that I had. Did I have a Susan version in this? Oh, it's in the Book of Daniel part that I have a Susan story time.
But important to note at the end of that thing about Isaiah 53 is that it does have, we see this first hint of this apocalypticism. And because it does talk about the end of times.
Yeah.
Right? It talks about it's not necessarily Judgment Day, but it is an apocalypse, right? Type of going to come back, and I'm going to come and I'm going to deal out suffering against your enemies type stuff. Mm-hmm. And so that's really the first time that we see that.
Yeah. And
then he kind of like he leads in and kind of goes back to Genesis again. But I think it was a really good idea for him to put that in there, as this is the first time we see the real idea that there is starting to be like a shift. Mm-hmm. This is what's actually going to happen now with Yahweh, what God's going to do with the coming kingdom, the coming garden, the utopia, the paradise.
Yeah, within our lifetime.
Yep, that's what it ends up being. Yeah.
So, okay.
So, yeah, go ahead.
So now we're at the Nephilim.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know why the Watchers made me so excited. I genuinely don't know. But I think it's because I just have a ton of notes on it. I don't know. So the idea of a future bodily resurrection of the dead is actually first seen in 1st Enoch, which, while popular, actually was not included in the Bible, which I imagine...
Horrible idea and choice. Seriously. Such good books.
Yeah, I've watched a couple of streams on it. They're absolutely batty, but they're fascinating.
Yeah, Enoch. He's from Genesis, man.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he was the first person who died, actually. So, obviously, he was the obvious choice to get these revelations, because supposedly it was all like, hey, you died, you're not existing anymore. So you obviously went to go be with God, right?
Well, Enoch didn't die. That's the thing.
Then why did Bart Ehrman say that he died?
Well, Enoch in the book of Enoch it doesn't die. He's one of the, that's the thing. I know it's, he is, the reason that he's able to carry this on is because he didn't die, just like Elijah doesn't die.
So he went up to be with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he doesn't. So, yeah, Enoch doesn't actually die.
Oh, okay. Then Dr. Ehrman is wrong.
Did you say that? I must have missed it, but
I wrote down Enoch equals the first person to die.
No, he said in Genesis 5:24, Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him. Yeah, he didn't actually die.
Then where did I get that from?
I don't know. It's what it seems like if you read it. If you read it, he walked with God and he was no more because God took him.
Okay.
And when we read that, it's what it seems like. But no, Enoch did not actually die.
Right.
Just like Elijah later on.
So there were actually 5 different writings to make up the Book of Enoch, or First Enoch, I guess, that were actually written by different authors at different times. And the most mysterious passage actually has to do with the story of the flood in the days of Noah, which I had this open and I made a note on what page it was on. Oh, that's not what I wanted. I know it's on page 110, so that's good. We just got to scroll down a lot.
I've got the passage up if you want me to read the Genesis passage.
Yes, please.
When people began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair and took wives for themselves and all that they chose. The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. Those were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Genesis 6, 1, 2, and 4. This is what... Oops, I accidentally hit the mute button. This is where a lot of those herders that I was talking about are like, oh, well, because there's an age of heroes that gets put an end to in the whole Zeus stories. Like, according to Hesiod, the Nephilim must have been the Greek gods. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. But anyway, that's my tangent. I'm going to let you guys go.
There you go. Hey, Mike. Good to see you.
Oh, hey, Pasta Mike. All right, so let me see where I went here. I'm so terribly sorry that I am all over the place. Yes, so the passage, what Ehrman says is that it seems like the passage is referring to like heavenly beings that came down and impregnated women that led to half divine and half human beings. So that would mean that they had half divine disbelief. That were meant to be
that was bad. I think you broke Nathaniel. You broke him. That
was off the cuff. That was not planned. You do not believe me.
No, it wasn't. No, it's not written there.
Oh, I'm very happy as a result of that really bad joke. Okay.
Damn it.
So God decides to punish everyone on earth, including those heavenly beings, which are the Watchers, and sentences them to eternal torment, which causes demons to emerge out of the Watchers' bodies, like rah, 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 so like in The Exorcist. So this is the first real example of the battle between good and evil, because God sends down judgment to punish the wicked so that the good can return to earth. And during these battles, heavenly realities are revealed to Enoch, including those about the future judgment and resurrection of the dead. So I wanted to just, it took everything in me to not write a cowabunga joke at Raphael.
Yeah.
Everything in me to not write that, but I said it, so you get that. So an angel named Raphael actually takes Enoch to see where the souls of the dead are held until the day of judgment. It's this high mountain containing 4 hollows that each holds a different variety of deceased soul, which will all suffer different fates. Now, suffer is a term that is used loosely because they're not all going to suffer, and I'm sorry, the cat is meowing again.
Yeah.
So there's the souls of the righteous who will be raised from the dead. There are sinners who didn't get punished on earth. So they're, boop, boop, the ends of the spectrum.
Hey, Brainbug.
Oh, hi, Brainbug. So there's also those who are sort of in between, but a little closer to righteous, but they were actually murdered by sinners. And then there are sinners who had already received punishment who will live forever in the hollow.
Mm-hmm.
And that reminds me of when we were talking about the Greco-Roman afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
And how they're just
specifically Plato's afterlife.
There we go.
Yeah,
Thank you. I was all like, I was trying to remember. How they're just sort of stuck there in limbo. They can't feel any pleasure. They can't actually like.
Well,
that's more Homer's afterlife.
Oh.
Like that's Plato's afterlife had the like 3 different tiers, which was like the the people who were good got to party for 1,000 years. The people who were crappy got like all of their transgressions burned out of them, and then the people in the middle kind of were somewhere in the middle, and they all got together before reincarnation.
Yeah, it's like the medium place.
Yeah, yeah. They and it's a very, very vague telling of what the idea of afterlife will be after this judgment.
Mm-hmm.
With those that are righteous being alive again. Good for you.
Yeah.
Which is interesting considering their concept of the soul and the body, but all right.
Yeah.
It doesn't really go into specifics.
All right. So moving on. Shut up, cat.
Wow.
She got fed earlier. I fed her.
And like I find it interesting that the righteous in First Enoch get the best farm on earth. Like ever. Like you basically get the most awesome GMO crops that God could possibly give you. In those days the earth will be tilled in righteousness, and all of it will be planted with trees and will be filled with blessing. And the vine which is planted on it will produce fruit in abundance, and every seed which is sown on it, every measure which will produce 1,000, and every measure of olives will produce 10 baths of oil. So like basically, Yahweh got all of the best scientists together, or became the best scientist, and he's like, you know what? I'm just going to break the laws of physics, and y'all are going to get awesomeness.
I mean, of course.
Yeah, which I guess if you're a god, you can do that.
True. Gods don't have to operate within the laws of physics, if you think about it.
Apparently.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard.
All right. So this is the one with the Susan story time.
Yeah, we get into Daniel.
Welcome to the Book of Daniel.
Yes. So yeah, this is not as small of a Susan story time as the one before, but it's still a Susan story.
I was speaking just specifically about the Book of Daniel and the that it is. Yes. I appreciate that Bart gets into it in the book. About how he doesn't get into it. That was probably written by 2 different people at 2 different times. But I appreciate that he gets into how the bit of dishonesty that happens in it and stuff. But then how people today, especially your evangelical, they're the ones that they speak in tongues.
Protestants?
Nope.
We used to call them, I'm trying to remember, because there was the evangelicals and the charismatics is what we used to call them at my church. The ones who, we also called them holy rollers, because they were the ones, holy rollers, because they were the ones who would roll around on the ground and speak in tongues.
Yeah, Pentecostalism.
Pentecostal.
So you have they are the, so these are the ones that are the, yes, they comment. These are the ones that have the ideas of Pentecostalism. This is the pre-trib rapture folks, and they are the Acts 27 or whatever it is people, and they take the Book of Daniel literally.
Oof.
And the way they read into that and stuff. I am just, if I live my life and never actually have to ever get into the Book of Daniel again to try to explain to somebody, I'm good.
Cool. Doesn't a small subset of those people also do venomous snake handling, and haven't several of their preachers died to that?
They have.
Yeah, that's of course out of the book of Mark, chapter 19. or chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, and which was not actually originally in the book of Mark, obviously. And it's not a subset of Pentecostalism necessarily, but it is in the same area, same vein of charismatic, yes. And but if you want to hear somebody actually talk about the book of Daniel, our good friend Dr. Josh at Digital Hammurabi did an amazing job. If you want to dig down deep into the book of Daniel because you hate yourself apparently, go do that. He's a great guy. He and his amazing wife, I think they're gonna have another little one.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Venom is pouring out of your ears, Nathaniel. You're just like so much hate for the book of Daniel.
I hate the book of Daniel. Hates it. He really does hate it. Like I have so much. I don't hate a book in the Bible more than the book of Daniel. Partially, again, it's partially because of what, the kind of churches that I went to and stuff, and how the book of Daniel is seen as this prophetic book for Jesus, and then into the end times, right? And it's like the book of Revelation, just sooner. And it's like you put them both together, and you see like the clay, and you see the other types of like dirt and stuff like that. And then you see something of bronze, and this is obviously, you have the head of an eagle, and this is obviously the United States. And then you've got like a bear, and that's obviously Russia. So Russia's bad, usher in the fucking end times. Let's get this shit going. Daniel Revelation, seriously.
Press F to pay respects for our like PG-13 rating. That is number 4.
Is that 4? I could rant about Daniel, Revelation, and Pentecostal bullshit probably for an hour. It is, and I used to know it, and that's the reason why.
Wow.
Yeah. Ugh.
So, getting into the book of Daniel, Susan story time.
Yes,
Susan
go ahead.
story
I'm gonna go puke over here. Go ahead.
Okay. So Alexander the Great died as a young man in 323 BCE. He conquered a bunch of territories that ended up being divided up among his generals. And for about 100 years, until around 198 BCE, I wrote BCW by accident, Judea was controlled by the Ptolemies, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Ptolemies. Yeah, Ptolemies. They are from Egypt.
So then it was passed to the Seleucids, who were the rulers of Syria. So about 30 years later, things suck for Judea.
Judea.
Doesn't matter. Okay. No. Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes?
Epiphanes.
Yay! I'm saying these things right.
I'm reading CNN.
What? Okay.
I just one of the president's guys lost, and so I'm really excited about that. Sorry, I just happened to see it. Go ahead.
Afterwards.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it.
Yeah. So Antiochus IV tried to unify his pretty vast empire by forcing Greek culture onto everyone. Now, some people liked it, who were embracing the language, the dress, the culture, the institutions, and the religion. Others, however, were pretty pissed that they couldn't keep worshiping as they had been before, and they had to do shit like violate their kosher food laws and cease circumcisions, which was, effectively stopping them from being Jewish. So in 167 BCE, a revolt was started by the Maccabees as a bunch of skirmishes that eventually turned into a full-on uprising that ended up with Antiochus's forces losing and the ouster of the Seleucid rulers from the land. She's lucky she's cute. She really is.
Apparently Bast has officially claimed both of my streams because all 4 of us were interrupted by cats last night too.
You know what? I'm okay with this. I'm surprisingly okay with this. Okay, so where did I go? So Judea became its own independent state and remained that way until Roman conquest in 63 BCE. Hello, there's a cat right there. Can you see her? Oh, okay. That's fine.
The cat is now speaking for Nathaniel, I guess, for a second.
Didn't she already eat? She did already eat. Okay, she's gonna... Yep. She's doing that. Okay. So, during this time, the book of Daniel was written and contains folktales of Judean exile and Daniel and his buddies resisting the foreign takeover, which mirrored how the Jews of the author's own day were able to try and resist the Seleucid takeover and Hellenization. The last 6 chapters are the apocalyptic visions given to Daniel, and they're weird as shit.
Yeah.
Weird as shit, meant to predict the future, and some massive catastrophes in the fight between good and evil, which, of course, God inevitably wins. The apocalyptic shit is almost always written with a pseudonym, and a bunch of it is circulated for about 400 years. So this is so, you know, shit gets attributed to religious leaders with the pseudonyms like Abraham and Moses and Adam. And since these books supposedly tell the future as a way to give people hope to hold on a little bit longer, it was sort of a way to convince those who were reading it that they totally knew what they were talking about.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a really interesting note at the end of this section where Ehrman talks about the easiest way to date this book when they were using this pseudonym is that he predicts Antiochus's death, which is a prediction that does not come true. Correct. But it also dates the book as sometimes before he died in 164 BCE. So it's not a super ancient book.
No. And he died in, like, Antiochus actually died in Persia?
164 in, yeah, it would have been Persia. Yeah, Seleucids and stuff.
So, I remembered that. Without writing it down, I'm so proud of myself. Oh my god, my cat is doing things to the Google Doc. All right. So, hello.
From Death to Life in Daniel, which this section actually starts with another quote. So Daniel is the first, in fact, only book of the Hebrew Bible to predict that a resurrection of the dead will come at the end of time. So this is the first non-apocryphal mention of this anywhere. But because we've spent so much time establishing all these apocryphal bits, it's clear that it had some of that foundation in those apocryphal works. So he quotes Daniel 12:1-3. As key to understanding the new Jewish view of the afterlife. At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish, such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, and everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and contempt. Those who are wise shall shine in the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever.
So what I can tell from that, is there's going to be like the time of anguish that Israel has never actually seen, but then there's like divine intervention, and a bunch of people is going to be raised from the dead, and one of the groups. But this one, if I'm remembering correctly, what?
Your mouse is hovering on remove.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one.
That's why I was like that.
No, I know, but the cat will click it.
No. So one of the groups is not going to actually end up experiencing the resurrection, and sort of like the ones that are stuck in the Hallows, they're just going to stay in that same place.
Very deathly.
Yeah, deathly. So the difference between Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel is that Daniel is talking about actual individuals and not the nation of Israel. And he says that their actual bodies will come back to life, but there is no word on how they're going to deal with the rigor mortis. That one I wrote down.
There you go.
So it's pretty heavily debated on who's actually going to get the everlasting life / resurrection. No matter who, because there's a bunch of different groups that they think it's going to be. But no matter who, it's obvious that is going to be those who are especially blessed by God. So they'll get a new life and a new location. But not
well, and he makes another note in that same section. This is the only place in the entirety of the New Testament where everlasting life is ever mentioned. So I find it interesting, and this is my note, that like Christians became so obsessed with that, and that's part of where I think some of that obsession with the book of Daniel comes from also, is that whole promise of heaven that Jesus very much harped on. This is the only place in the entire old, officially recognized Old Testament where you get that promise.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense.
Which brings us to the section on resurrection only to destroy people's bodies, which is really, really interesting, because I know that there are some Christian sects that believe that there's not an eternal torment in a fire and brimstone hell, but rather people are just going to have their souls brought back long enough to be destroyed.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
So I had written down Psalms of Solomon as POS, which makes me giggle a little bit.
It's not a bad book.
We're back in the Apocrypha, boys.
Yeah. It's like we're back in the stuff that people don't usually know about, myself included.
Yeah, no, it's very few people know about these books.
Yeah, so Psalms of Solomon says that the judgment will happen to everybody and not just some people. Like, it's very specific that it is actually everybody is involved in this.
Which one could argue, given what we now know, is a pretty dang unjust God. Like, there's a bunch of people who don't know about his existence, and he's like, I'm gonna punish y'all anyway. There are 3 quotes here. I don't know if you guys want to read them all, but there's 3 different quotes. All of them come from Psalms of Solomon. 2 of them come from Psalms of Solomon 13. The other one comes from Psalms of Solomon 15.
Yeah, so I have those pulled up. Oh, luckily they're relatively short. We can take one each.
Sure.
You want to take one each?
Sure.
Which one do you want, Nathaniel?
For the life of the righteous goes on forever, but sinners shall be taken away to destruction, and no memory of them will ever be found. Psalms of Solomon 13:11. That is, of course, the annihilation.
Mm-hmm.
So then we have the destruction of the sinner is forever, and he will not be remembered when God looks after his righteous. But those who fear the Lord shall rise up to eternal life, and their life shall be in the Lord's light, and it shall never end. Psalms of Solomon 3:11 and 12.
And we have, sinners shall perish forever in the day of the Lord's judgment, when God oversees the earth at his judgment. But those who fear the Lord shall find mercy in it, and shall live by their God's mercy. But sinners shall perish for all time. Psalms of Solomon 15:11 through 13. They really wanted you to know that sinners are going to get brought back just so they can die again. Like, just to make dang sure they're dead. Like, as if they weren't dead enough already.
Right, and that's kind of a dick move.
It's the end of times judgment.
Retribution.
Well, yeah, it's the end of times judgment, basically.
Yeah.
You'll be judged for what you did, no matter how long it's going to be from whenever you died. You'll be asleep anyway.
Right.
So you're not going to know. It's going to be just like before. You're just going to like wake up for a second. You're going to hate it anyways, because that's what we actually saw in like with Ezekiel.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're to be annihilated. The sinners shall perish for all time.
Fun.
And I actually, this becomes a recurring theme. Oh, by the way.
I mean, yeah, I feel like a lot of stuff in the Bible is a recurring theme.
So then Ehrman circles back in Resurrection and Immortality to Plato and the Greek thought that, in ancient Greece, there was a clear dichotomy between the soul and the body, but in, Judea, not so much. It's very clear that in ancient Israelite thought, the body is the person, and once your breath is gone, it's gone. There ain't no more of you unless God brings your body back.
Right.
But he does start to hint that, the idea of potential immortality is still present, at least somewhat, in these later passages.
Yeah, and I know in there's some of the later Jewish doctrine, God actually reverses death by bringing back the breath of life and ensuring that the body will never die again because the person is made immortal.
Yep. And
which I feel like was what you just said.
Immortal. Well, it's not immortal necessarily, but
in layman's terms,
sure.
In the way that I understand,
sure.
Well, and one of the things that he points out, and I love the sort of tongue-in-cheekness of this, and I know, Nathaniel, you're going to have a lot to say about it. Jesus was not unique in his views at that time of this idea of a resurrection into a perfect earth of people getting to function forever and ever, as farmers on this earth. It was a fairly commonly held view, among Jews at the time. So he very much could have been just an ordinary Jewish rabbi who, took on this more, I guess, messianic role after his death, or at the very least saw himself as the warlord leader Messiah later on.
Yeah.
Hmm.
The only thing that I'm going to touch on that is that not the Jews that would have held these ideas would have been from the northern end of Syria or Palestine towards Syria, and they would have been the Maccabeans and those that would have written the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff like that, and especially those that led up to the Maccabean revolt. And actually, I was mentioning to Susan that John the Baptist would have been born into this, and then of course he was the teacher of Jesus, and so would have had that. And realistically, Jesus would have thought he was the Messiah, the Son of God, the Anointed One, but not the warlord version, which we can actually see in all four of the Gospels when the Passion narrative begins.
Especially John.
Yeah.
Super Jesus.
Still turns around and says, why are you cutting off this person's ear? Don't you know that I didn't come to bring a sword, you know? Yeah. And it's not the first time he says that either, which is very, very important. And, but so there were other deification things that happened after the fact, but this was not unique. No. And it's also, this was a couple of hundred years prior to Jesus. So not unique, but also not spread throughout all of Palestine. This would have been on the northern end up by the Sea of Galilee. So,
which is not something that Ehrman actually specifies. He says in the book, this is not to deny the unique importance of the doctrine of resurrection as developed in Judaism in the years leading up to the life of Jesus. Indeed, it is fair to say that by the time of Christianity, most Jews held to some version of that doctrine, believing in a future restoration and resuscitation of the body that did not involve simply a temporary return to life, but an entrance into life eternal, not lived as a disembodied soul, but as a unified person, body and soul. That, we will see, was also the view of Jesus and his followers, who, as a consequence, did not maintain that when a person died, their soul separated from their body and went to heaven or hell. On the contrary, they were Jewish apocalypticists.
Yeah. And that's, yeah. And your apocalypticists were more on the north side of town, really.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And
well, that's part of the joy of doing something like this, right? You get to add your own knowledge on top of it.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons that you get a lot of the Sadducees, right? And you get a lot of the Pharisees. And of course, Saul had been a Pharisee, but also Jesus was a Pharisee and everything except for the resurrection thing. And they would have been down from Jerusalem, and they were more of like the old guard, where they did not actually take to this type of apocalypticist ideology or belief system. And so there were definitely some schisms there. The way the Sanhedrin are presented in the Bible as well is kind of unique, because they certainly didn't have the type of power around the middle of the first century that they're supposed to have had regarding Pilate around the year 30. But you would have their power would have been slowly ebbed away over time, and this was done on purpose by those in Rome, but that also led to the bleeding in of this apocalypticist stuff. Now, that's not to say, by the way, that very few Jews accepted this idea of Jesus rising from the dead.
Right.
Yeah. Had it stuck in Jerusalem and into Palestine first century, nothing would have come of it.
No.
The Jews did not accept this at all, really almost at all. And only on in certain areas that they even accept anything like this type of judgment that was to come, that Jesus was mentioning. Right. So or John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. I don't know what I was going for there. Well, that was a really good chapter. I really liked that one. Personally.
Yeah, we're finally starting to get into the origins of some of the stuff where we recognize a little bit.
Yeah. And seeing it from Ehrman's critical point of view. And when I say critical, I mean in not in an actually bad critical thing. Seeing it through his lens, I guess a scholarly lens in all technicality, is definitely... It's very enlightening. I really like it. And then, as always, I definitely appreciate that he's explaining like I'm 5.
Yeah, I like that he does that in these books as well. Yeah. And as well as I like how he kind of puts it all together. He brings up, Menelaus again, and Plato, and it really kind of goes back to this is what this seems like it is.
Yeah.
And to where it may seem like it takes it from these Hellenistic ideas, but in fact, because you can see the similarities, but in fact, this is what it actually is. And I appreciate that he brought up the Zoroaster thing, but didn't go into it in a lot of detail.
Yeah.
Because But and yeah, these types of books that are really easy to read.
There's a lot of pop blisters for you in this chapter, isn't there?
I know it depends on how much more we get into with other with other things like talking about like other gods and stuff like that. Possibly they've been around about the same time. I don't know if he brings up like Apollonius and stuff like that. I just don't. But
well, I know that there's a big discussion of martyrdom in the next chapter. Like we deep dive right back into that, like calling back to the first chapter.
Cool.
Nice.
That'd be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jewish martyrs, man.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. So next week we are going to have chapter 7. So chapter 7 is entitled "Why Wait for the Resurrection? Life After Death, Right After Death." So I am very excited for that one. As always, I will make sure to include at least one Susan version of a story, if I can fit it in there. We'll see.
Good idea.
Yeah. So yeah, that does it for us this evening. Aaliyah, do you have anything that you want to plug, add, anything that you want to talk to anybody about?
Plugs wise, there's actually two kind of big things that are going to be going on over on my channel. The first is that tomorrow, my buddy Christy Abbey, who was in the chat, we just did a collab that we recorded today, and she said that she's going to be posting it on her channel tomorrow around 6 o'clock PST / 9 o'clock EST. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that. We get out into the weeds, but we talk a lot about trans issues and about neurodivergence. We talk a lot about ADHD and autism. And we touch a little more on some of the subjects in the collab that we didn't get as much into on the J.K. Rowling turf video, and kind of go deeper into some of those topics. We also talk about like dysphoria and dysmorphia and how one can often be mistaken as the other. So things that are not talked about as often in the trans community. The other big one is I've got a premiere at the same time on Thursday. My video is called "Is Zeus a Predator?" and it's talking about the licentious exploits that people like to make fun of with the Greek gods, and why it's kind of silly that they do that, because not only do modern pagans not generally think that they were literal, but ancient pagans probably didn't either.
I'm excited to watch that one.
There you go.
Definitely going to be me learning something new.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yep. And we got a video coming out here, hopefully very soon. We're still doing some research on it. It is a very socially relevant video, one that we had not made yet, at least on this particular topic. So definitely it's been the most difficult video to make yet.
Yeah.
You got a lot of help with the voice work on that one.
Yeah, not as much as I wanted, and also a lot of people said they were going to send stuff the next day, and they never did. So
it happens.
But yes, got a lot of folks that are helping out with that.
Yeah.
And so we're hoping to have that one out here pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
We're still reading and doing research on it as well. It's become larger than we thought it would be. So
yeah, they always do though.
I mean, yeah, my Rowling collab, I expected to be like 3 people, and then it was 7.
But that ended up great.
Yeah,
that video was amazing.
Yeah, it was really great.
And I'm not just saying that because I'm in it.
I think that the way that we have said this, I put it on Twitter the other day. I'm pretty certain that our video is going to piss a bunch of people off, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But I think that is it for us today, this evening, for the secular literary circle, right? That's what it is.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
Yes. Well, y'all have a wonderful night. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to like and subscribe. Subscribe to Aaliyah Kai's channel as well. And we will see y'all next week. Bye, y'all.
Have a good night, guys.